Welcome to this second clinic on linking social protection, employment and economic inclusion in times of COVID-19 and beyond. I want to welcome the experts we have today with us. We have 7 experts plus all of you in the public who are joining, and I'm recognizing already several names. I just want to introduce you formally to the people who are here with us today. We have Anna McCord, who's a social protection researcher and consultant and specializes in the design of social protection policy with a focus on public works and strategic climate change interventions. We have Carolina de Miranda, who works on the graduation, who's director for graduation programs at Fondation Capital. We have Julie, who's a technical advisor with the BRAC Ultrapro Graduation Initiative. We have Miguel Peromingo, who's a senior expert on global labor markets and employment services. Rodolfo Beasley, who's an independent researcher and consultant specialized in social protection and shock responsive social protection in particular. And Renata Nowak-Garmer, who works with the UNDP in Africa, particularly on employment and social protection programs. We also have Samir, who's joining us for the second time today. He works at the Asian Development Bank and supports areas of education, skills development, social protection and training. So thanks a lot to all of you for being resident experts today. My name is Aude de Montesquieu. I'm a social protection specialist with the Partnership for Economic Inclusion at the World Bank. This session is co-hosted by PEI, the partnership, and SPEC. SPEC is the Social Protection for Employment Community of Practice, which is an online community that helps facilitate knowledge exchange on linking social protection and employment, and which is supported by GIZ and BMZ, the German Corporate Development Corporation, and DFAT, the Australian Development, Australian Aid. I want to welcome you all on behalf of both of us host organizations to this session. The purpose of the session is really what I was described this as a bona fide Q&A, but really I'm keeping this idea of something that is relatively spontaneous and allows for peer-to-peer interaction between all of us. So please, be reminded that you might be caught a little off guard and be put on the spot because we want everybody, including people in the public, to chime in if they want and if they have contributions to make on a specific point. Why this session today? Really, I mean, we all know that the COVID-19 pandemic is accentuating the risks that are faced by poor and vulnerable people in many different ways. First, the health shock, but also the pandemic and the associated lockdowns has had devastating economic impacts on the livelihoods of very poor people. And this morning we were reminded also the not so poor, but who are being brought into poverty because of the current pandemic and the lockdowns. This has motivated many governments across the world to use social protection as a first, in particular social assistance, as a first phase of short-term response to the pandemic. But in this session, we're going to talk specifically how governments in particular can use the existing, can use these social protection measures and build on economic and employment programs to help rejigger the livelihoods of very poor people impacted by the pandemic. We're going to try and be really specific, and here I'm asking the experts again to try and be really specific in your answers on the opportunities and challenges of linking employment and economic inclusion programs to social protection programming in different countries or regions where you work, with, if possible, given this morning had a lot of focus on Asia, if you can take examples from Latin America and Africa, it's all the better. Of course, Samir and others, if you have examples from Asia, that's also, I mean, very relevant, but let's try and get as many country examples as we can. And you know, really, again, the idea for this session is that it's you know, anyone can chime in, and please bear in mind that we are using Slido for people to submit their questions real time. We'll try and answer real time, and if we cannot, please continue posing your questions, because the Slido is open until October 8th, and we will definitely commit to answering the questions after this session if there are things we were not able to address. With that, I'd like to turn to the Slido. People can access the link in the chat box here. You can have a quick skim of the different questions and see where the votes have gone. I took some time beforehand to kind of organize these questions a bit, and want to suggest that, you know, a bit of an organizing principle. I think we're seeing quite a few questions on the vision and objectives for economic inclusion and employment programs, and how they can help poor people restart their livelihood. So there's a whole bunch of questions around the vision, the objectives, and the potential of this type of program, and then quite a few questions in particular for the speakers on this session that are much more kind of directed towards precise design and delivery issues, really focusing particularly in this session around questions on informality, public works, and then we have some other questions, as you'll see in the Slido, around gender, technology, graduation and its cost of graduation type economic inclusion programs and their cost effectiveness. And so depending on the time and the questions that keep popping up, we'll turn to those. So please don't hesitate to like the questions or comment on the questions you particularly want to see answered. And without further ado, I'll get the conversation started with a question first to Miguel and Rodolfo, asking you, in your country or region, the places where you work, how are employment and economic inclusion programs seen in the face of COVID? Are they considered as a potential medium or long-term response? Can you give a few concrete examples of the specific opportunities and challenges in your region? Thank you.
I can start if you like.
Yep, please.
Okay, so I'm Miguel. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you. Yeah, I mean, I've been looking a lot to the European Union countries, but also within OECD countries in Latin America, so Chile and Colombia. And there is quite a trend there to reform. So, because when we look at COVID-19 response, many of the measures have been very short-term to help out. But there is also a tendency to look into longer-term policy measures to reform the labor market and to increase the inclusion. I have a figure here that 100% of OECD countries are using financial support to firms, and more than 30% of them are ready to do long-term reforms, for example, around reducing workers' exposure, general occupational safe and healthy measures, income support for sick workers, and helping people to stay in their homes or in their livelihoods more long-term if they cannot displace to the to the place of work. So I think there is a lot of movement towards longer term policy measures. As for what concretely is, like, what are the success factors, let's say, for long-term policy measures to connect social measures with labor market inclusion? I think key to that is to get the real labor market information, what is out there right now, real time. So what are the vacancies? What are the actual vacancies that employers, enterprises offer, also on the informal level, on the, let's say, micro level, and how can that be turned into work? And then approach and have a kind of sound, and Chile and Colombia are doing a lot around this at the moment, do skills training, like have a sound cooperation with skills development providers to upskill the job seekers, no matter which level of vulnerability they have, because the possibility of working from home and the possibility to be digitally connected opens a lot of avenues also in poorer regions to be able to work. And then and there is also, we see in Latin America the tendency to do that more, labor market information systems that are a bit more longer term, that record things that happened on the labor market during this COVID-19 crisis in the first couple of months, and are developing now, and from that develop with big data strategies, perspectives for the future. So that as a kind of very general overview of what I've been seeing.
Great, thank you, Miguel. And Rodolfo, as you chime in, also a quick question. You know, we heard from Miguel right now that you need sound collaboration, sound coordination, in his words, around you know, linking social measures with social protection programming. And so I'm going to just add a little question, like the tag-along question from the Slido. We were asked, are we pushing too much onto social protection programs? I'm kind of paraphrasing, but there was a question around, are we just putting too many baubles on the Christmas tree? So as you respond to this question, if you can also, you know, think about, consider answering that second point about, you know, the baubles on the Christmas tree. Thanks. Over to you.
Thank you. Great. Well, I'm also gonna focus on Latin America for my short answer. Yes, I mean, I agree with Miguel. We are seeing an increasing trend in terms of longer term reforms, but I think that this is more recent, of the last couple of months. Now, at the beginning of the pandemic, the responses focused mostly on income support, cash transfers, and so on, some social security measures as well, and then also some economic inclusion programs in the region were suspended, or some aspects of the operations were suspended. Others were adapted with new protocols for safeguarding social distancing. Health related measures were put in place in some cases, but we didn't see a lot of scaling up, no, compared to unconditional cash transfer programs. Now, with the duration of the crisis and the economic impact of the crisis and the job losses, we know that governments are increasingly considering scaling up and reforming economic inclusion programs. For example, a few weeks ago, the government of Peru announced a huge expansion of a few programs, all of them economic inclusion programs, including Trabaja Perú, which is a public program. I also wanted to mention that in Latin America in particular, this crisis takes place jointly with the Venezuela crisis, no, which has affected many countries, since it is a migration flow It's probably the highest in the region for many, many, many years, which of course affects labor markets in many host countries and communities. No, so countries were already thinking about how to adapt economic inclusion programs to this other crisis. And in relation to putting probably too much pressure on social protection, well, yeah, I mean, there is a risk. It's also happening in other sectors. This crisis is huge, and well, I mean, that's one of the drawbacks, I guess. But I mean, in Latin America, of course, it's a very diverse region, and there are countries that have very strong social protection systems that may be able to adapt, cope, and scale up, while others are still quite weak. And yeah, we should be careful about overburdening them. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is really important. I want to open up. Does anyone want to comment on this question of, over the burdening social protection systems and need for coordination? Please, if you want to chime in from the floor, please chime in now. Otherwise, I will turn to Anna for a series of questions on public works. But let me just take 2 seconds. Anyone? No. Okay, so Anna, over to you on public works. We got a series of questions, both in the Slido, and then this morning we had a very lively sessions, and there were participants, including people like Mito from the ILO, who posed a series of questions around the potential for public work programs to adapt to the current COVID crisis and to offer a potential response, medium-term response for very poor people. So if you can comment on that, and then I'll ask you a follow-on question around the potential you see in those types of programs for a Green New Deal and a strategic climate change adaptation programs. So first, about the potential for public works, if you can chime in. Thanks a lot, Anna.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think I'd actually like to start by responding to the point that Rodolfo and Miguel were making about overburdening public works, the issue overburdening social protection. And I think as we go into this discussion, it would be really useful to think about the scale of the challenge. And what we've been hearing is that we are about to face one of the largest, most significant depressions that the world has ever faced, and certainly in terms of probably the largest global depression. And we're talking about really significant contraction in GDP. And of course, that varies depending on how integrated countries are into the global economy. But we're seeing a significant contraction of employment in formal and informal sectors. And this is going to be an issue for the medium term. And I think it's really worth seeing it in that context, and perhaps just reflecting back historically at perhaps the closest precedent we have for this, which will be the 1930s. And what we saw then was a very strong realization that providing some kind of employment support or income for workers who were no longer required by the market, this was seen as a priority because there was a very strong recognition that failure to address this would contribute to destabilization, to the rise of extremist groups, political breakdown, even sort of economic breakdown, because it came very soon after the First World War. And so the consequence was that at this time there were massive interventions to try and ensure that the poorest and those who lost their employment opportunities actually had access to some kind of state support. And rather fascinatingly, I think a lot of us have heard about the New Deal in the States in the 1930s, but there were actually dozens and dozens of similar programs. Fascinatingly, they were in Europe, they were also in Asia, they were also in Africa. And so we actually saw a large-scale response to these same kind of challenges of mass employment deficit. And I think it's really important to put it in this kind of context. So yes, we mustn't overload existing social protection systems. I think that's key. But what we face instead is how do we respond? Because we have to have a large-scale response. And I think there needs to be a real dialogue and integration between ministries of employment, infrastructure investment, and social protection, because more of the same won't do. I think at this point in the global crisis, tinkering at the edges, looking at adapting small-scale programs isn't going to be the way forward. We have to really look perhaps more ambitiously at how we rethink the provision of mass-scale support for those who can no longer find employment in the labour market. And in a sense, this has the characteristics of a slow onset emergency. We know that this situation is going to deteriorate. We know it's going to last for a number of years. And so now we have to be trying to think outside the box a little bit about how we link labour markets and social protection. So probably loading up our existing interventions may not be the way forward. We may need to do some blue sky thinking and perhaps learn from the past. And perhaps even more recently, we have initiatives such as the Jefes and Jefes program in Argentina, which was a response to the economic crisis there in the early 2000s. So we need to be looking, I think, historically at how we have been able to provide large-scale provision. Thank you.
Thanks, extremely insightful. We just got a question on Slido, which I think is really interesting in relation to how do we differentiate between the global labor market activations program, the need for global labor market activations programs at very large scale, and then the need for targeted measures that are really, really focused on the extreme poor and most vulnerable. And Anna, I think that I wanted to tag it on here because I think it's really in the line of this question of how do we do something ambitious at scale, and how do we balance that with the need for targeted, deeply targeted measures for those who are really left behind. Does anyone in the group of experts want to answer this question on the spot? Anna, do you want to?
Yeah, no, I'd just be happy to comment in as much as, I mean, cash transfers are obviously one very pragmatic way of responding to targeted needs. But I think what we see is that there isn't always an appetite for significant scale cash transfer provision. And we have to look at the political and the ideological context. So in some instances, I think targeted measures using the most efficient, the most cost-effective, the most pragmatic approach, that might be cash transfers, but that may not always be politically acceptable. And perhaps some form of self-targeting is one approach. I think you have the difficulty between this need for mass provision and also for targeted provision. And it may be that we really have to have different instruments for these different groups, but always taking into account both what's pragmatic and practical. I mean, how does one actually target those groups? But also what's politically acceptable. Because I think it's interesting, if you look at the range of responses which have happened, there has still been some kind of reticence to look at large-scale cash transfer provision in many countries in the regions we're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Over to Julie. Julie, I'd like you to chime in because at BRAC you're implementing deeply targeted graduation type programs. And so I'd like to ask you, how is BRAC seeing this trade-off, and how are you using graduation programs to support people affected by COVID-19?
Yeah, thanks so much, Aude. I think that a good question to start with is around the quality of the data that we have to work from for both populations, and making sure that national registries are looking more holistically at vulnerabilities and understanding how to properly support those populations, both global and the extreme poor. I think that's a huge deficit in a lot of the places that we work, is that we don't have a full picture of what the needs are, and therefore can't respond holistically and appropriately with the right kinds of programs that create long-term sustainable sort of progress for those communities. So I think that's one big area for us at BRAC in the work that we're doing in UPGI. In terms of our COVID response, and perhaps I can just talk a little bit about some of the adaptations that we've seen in some of our programming as part of this. So a good number of our programs have obviously stopped given the restrictions in mobility and ability to access participants, but a good number of them have continued and adapted to maintain some kind of connection in progress for those that are currently enrolled. So that includes leveraging technology and continuing the coaching and mentorship piece through mobile phones and radio and some other innovations, deeper connections and coordination with local government and other ministries. I think this sort of speaks back to one of the first questions that Rodolfo and Miguel were speaking about, the need for coordination and interministerial coordination and leveraging things that already exist on the ground, but making sure that they're more targeted to those that don't typically have access to those resources. And then the biggest part for us in COVID is making sure that the assets are still productive. So figuring out how to adapt to risks in local markets and regional markets that have arisen because of COVID, advising on diversification, advising on savings and investments. So that's sort of the bulk of our sort of efforts in COVID response have been targeted for our participants.
Thank you very much, Julie. I'd like to turn to Carolina. Fundación Capital is also providing technical assistance to governments and implementing pilots on using the graduation approach. I'd like to ask you specifically on this question of, how are you fostering better coordination between both the different public sector actors and also the private sector? Since, there's, as Julie just said, there's a need for a very coordinated response, especially at this time.
Yeah, well, I would say that it's always important to find common ground around different actors and have some political economy mapping before you start an intervention, so you can understand what are the motivations, what are the needs of each actor, and then collaboration can be effective. And also I think it's important to find champions within the systems that we work, within the governments, people that support this type of intervention, and within the private sector as well. They can amplify the need for this type of interventions among their peers. And it's always important to connect with these people that see this type of intervention as key to improve and enhance social protection systems. Also, I would say that when we work, Fundación Capital always try to implement our graduation programs in partnership with the governments. We believe that implementing graduation within public policy can increase the sustainability of programs. So we always start with a small pilot to gather the evidence in order to be able to have a strong base to present to the government and engage them in a larger scale implementation. So this scaling up phase is quite important for us. And well, to finish, I think it's important when we think about the private sector, to think about private-public partnerships. For example, in Paraguay, we implemented a private-public partnership to develop a specific sector, the chamomile tea sector. So we found a necessity within the private sector to have better producers, and we saw an opportunity to engage small producers in this value chain. So when we engage different actors in a common purpose, I would say that this increases the effectiveness of implementation and the possibilities to be able to scale up an intervention.
Thank you so much. I don't know, Rodolfo, if you saw my comment in the chat box, but if you don't, I'm going to put you on the spot. I wanted to ask you, I think we've heard quite a few people refer to to this crisis as a kind of slow on-take emergency, to quote Anna, but that social protection, when we had strong social protection systems in place, there were many things to build on. And And I'd like to ask you, you know, how can we make sure that social protection systems are best prepared? How can we kind of enhance the shock responsiveness or shock preparedness of social protection systems? We heard, you know, Julie talk about the need for national registries to be in place. We heard several people talking about existing employment programs, existing social support programs that you could just roll out in times of crisis. Julie made reference, and so did Carolina, to digitized delivery, etc. So do you have any comment to make about how systems can be best prepared for this type of emergency or slow on take emergency?
Thank you. Yes, so what we have seen in this crisis and in previous crises as well is that there are three key factors that enable governments scaling up social protection or adapting social protection. One is preparedness. I'm going to focus on that to answer the question. The other one is political will and the policy decision at the highest level, no? And then of course financing. And in relation to preparedness, countries are increasingly investing in preparing social protection to respond to different types of shocks. Of course, that if you have a system that has already substantial coverage with different types of programs, benefits, services, and so on, that provides a good opportunity for scaling up or adapting when there is a crisis. But then, yes, there are a number of issues, and we've seen countries developing protocols, what sometimes is referred as scalability frameworks, capacity, coordination mechanisms, information systems. So there are a number of things that countries have been doing to prepare themselves for responding. But what is also very important is to create this flexibility within the system, no? Because I mean, you can prevent and prepare for some kind of recurrent shocks, let's say, no? But there are other shocks, like for example, this current pandemic, which you can't foresee, no? And therefore you need to have a system that has that kind of flexibility to adapt to this to a new context and increasing demands. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rodolfo. We're getting questions in the chat box, including one. We focus right now a lot on household level type of interventions, person level interventions. We've got a question here from Nirmal Chobang on experiences with social protection systems and initiatives that are implemented by the communities themselves. I'd like to ask that question to Renata from UNDP, if you can comment on community level interventions that are being implemented in the region you work in.
Yes, thanks very much, and thanks for this question and for the interesting discussion. So I work in Africa, and the context is quite different. First of all, the state-sponsored social protection system is quite small, as you probably know. Only around 17 people have access to any form of social protection through the state-run systems. And so if we think about, just to sort of comment on the previous conversation, if we think about economic inclusion and doing something really midterm, it really would be a traditional extension of social protection to informal economy workers that currently have no access to anything at all. And I think that would economically empower them in the first place, perhaps more than the emphasis on skills and all sorts of measures that we typically talk about when we talk about economic empowerment. But in this question, I really wanted, this is a very interesting question, and I'm very passionate about it, so I wanted to contribute on it, is that we in Africa, and of course in other regions as well, but in Africa in particular, we have a very long history of mutual support mechanisms that exist completely outside of the state domain, and they really have been Also, they have not been studied properly in terms of their contribution to the so-called social protection, but they perform social protection functions. And so you have different saving mechanisms, community, mutual societies, funeral societies, all sorts of different organizations, civil society or civil or community-based organization that are in existence for years and help in times of crisis. The problem is that in terms of the massive shock that COVID has put on everyone, they have very limited ability to really perform their functions. They usually are better placed in terms of household shocks and not the large community or national or global wide shocks. And it will be very interesting to see how they have, because we sort of started looking at what they've been doing in terms of response to crisis, and there has been a lot of organizing at the community level, for example, in Ethiopia, with funeral societies that they help those people in communities that have absolutely no income. But it will be important. It will be interesting to see a little bit more on the macro level how they've been dealing with this crisis. But more importantly, what we don't pay enough attention to, and at UNDP we have a very small research project on this right now, is how we can actually strengthen these mechanisms and how to ensure complementarities between the non-state and the state provision, which I think it's very much needed. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Renata. I see that we have a comment in the chat box from Marco from FAO about how programs can adapt their targeting real time. And I'm quoting him, probably having to forego precision for greater speed. What are the implications of this? I'd like to ask this question to you, Miguel, and others, please jump in. Thank you.
If you ask me, I think all employment inclusion is targeted. So, I mean, the most successful activation programs are always targeted to specific groups, vulnerable groups, if you want to call them like this, or groups with specific needs, or cohorts that have specific skill sets, but have also obstacles to enter the labor market. Young people, say, women, people that have been very far away from the labor market or have been in informal work settings for a long time. So yes, I think that activation programs need to have a speedy, but at the same time, very targeted way of going to where the target group is. And I think that's also at the same time the main issue that a lot of activation programs have that are set up on rather a macro level or on a general national level, that they don't really reach the people. So you need to have agents in place that help doing this. Employment services, for example, would be an obvious pick, whether public or private, but also the employers. You need to have the employers on the boat. You need to have the employers, whether it's through a system of collective bargaining or social dialogue, you need to have the employers in the discussion of how do we activate to take their responsibility in making the labor market a place that includes vulnerable groups as well. So let me know if that answers the question, but just in a nutshell, I think targeted labor market programs need to have employers on board, and they need to be quick going to where it happens, to where the skills are.
Thank you very much, Miguel. I'd like to turn back to Anna because we have several questions around public works. But before I ask you your question directly, Anna, I'd like to take a moment if you want to comment on what Miguel just said, you know, his reflection on targeting and targeting errors of large-scale public works programs and how those can be improved. And then, you know, if you want to comment on that. And then to your question, you know, how do you think public works as a form of social protection can also, help provide a large-scale response, and also start, providing a response to climate change issues? So, a comment on Miguel's targeting question, and then the question of the Green New Deal and how public works can help.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think the big challenge to the kind of responses that Miguel was outlining is the fact that you've got this severe ongoing contraction of demand, and that is going to be a real challenge for any programs which are using principles of graduation and skills building. Because what we're seeing is this contraction of demand is going to affect increasingly both the formal and informal sectors. So in a sense, we have to run to stand still in this kind of context. So I think what we're seeing now is going to be a real challenge for the kind of interventions that Julie and Miguel were both outlining, because the underlying fundamentals of the labour market have deteriorated so significantly. And so I think this is a real challenge. And so perhaps I think we need to be thinking about what kind of demand-driven provision can we make. So perhaps I think one of the commentators was saying, is it time to move? We have to maybe lose some precision in targeting if we're going to really do large-scale support, labour market-based support. So I think that there is a trade-off, but perhaps in this instance we really need to be accepting that and saying, okay, we need to look at how we can go to scale to compensate for the contraction in the labour market, because it's a very changed situation from that in which we were operating perhaps a year ago. And just to respond to something Renata said, she was talking about horizontal social protection, and I think we have to recognise that that's taken a huge blow, particularly if we're looking at countries like Somalia, which are highly dependent on remittances. Other countries also in Africa, but Somalia is a particularly strong example. The absolute collapse of remittance transfers, which were a kind of informal domestic-based social protection, is having a significant impact. So I think we need to also factor into our discussions the loss of some of these informal sources of social protection. And then I think just very briefly, a lot of the to answer your question, Aude, about the potential role of public works, I think we need to look at this in the context of many of the comments which are coming through about how we're going to look at financing, this whole financing debate in middle and low income countries. How might large scale social protection provision be financed? And I think this is where we really have to be creative, because clearly the economic priority in most countries is macroeconomic stabilization. And we are seeing huge flows of resources, both domestic resources and multilateral resources, to function as kind of macroeconomic stabilizers. And I think this is where we need to really think how we can link the social protection interventions with Ministry of Labour interventions and Ministry of Finance, and think about how we can ensure that those kind of massive stabilization flows can be used to create employment. So we need to look at the nature of employment which is being created, because it is possible to find ways forward which would combine both the macroeconomic stabilization function but also the labour market support. And so what we need to be thinking about is what kinds of transfers will actually get resources to those worst affected by the crisis. And I think here there is actually an opportunity. And there's been an ongoing debate over the last few years about how the Paris Accords can be realized, and how countries can move through to zero emissions economies in the coming decades. And I think there's a real danger that the whole green debate will be lost, and resources for taking forward the green agenda will also be lost. And I think that actually there is an opportunity here for a kind of win-win, because even before the crisis, the COVID crisis, there was a recognition that it would be possible to use macroeconomic investment as a way to promote green transformation, but also create employment. And I think that this has been bubbling up from a number of countries, and I can share some resources, because it's interesting to see how many different countries, both developing and developed, have actually been exploring this idea. And I think if we look at how to harness those kind of stabilization flows so that they support labour markets and some kind of basic social protection, and also focus on creating assets and economic transformation interventions, which can really strategically start to address climate change impacts, that would be a win-win. And I think what we've had is a kind of tokenistic linkage of social protection with climate change in the past on a very small and exploratory scale. But this is actually an opportunity to harness the macroeconomic flows, look at climate change and provide employment. And I think that would really require some blue sky thinking, but seeing how we can address these different priorities, the climate priority, the employment priority, and the macroeconomic priority through unified interventions. But it really needs discussion at quite a significant, at a senior level, at a kind of ministerial level in countries, and also I think at the level of the multilaterals.
Thank you. Actually, good opportunity to welcome Samir to the debate. Samir from Asian Development Bank. I just want to ask you, can you reflect on this question between the link to of activation, social protection programs, and the Green New Deal that Anna was talking about? And then Julie, Carolina, and Renata, I'll be asking you questions about how you're using technology in the face of the COVID response to further adapt the design and delivery of your programs. You can respond only if you want to. We're close to wrapping up. So Samir, over to you, and the others right after. Thanks.
Thank you, Aude. The link between the social protection and labor market programs, of course, as we talked this morning, it was difficult even in good times, right? So now maybe it's more difficult. Maybe there's a lot of impetus towards that. That's that's an open question. But one example that I can share is from Indonesia, where in Indonesia, in response to the crisis, in trying to provide income support, what the country has done is that they have a pre-employment program called Kartu Prakarja. It's a pre-employment card. So that program has been rejigged to provide sort of unemployment benefit, sort of. So that sort of has been used as a type of income support. So you've seen the program is designed for training, it's designed as an activation measure, but now it's been linked up with unemployment benefit. And that is a good example where perhaps, so maybe it's happening sort of, or in an organic way, that we are linking social protection with the employment programs, because we see because of this crisis, because of COVID, that it makes more sense now, perhaps. So it's yet to be seen. So that's, I think, one good example we are seeing from our part of the world, and ADB is supporting in that effort as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. So just to start with Renata, I know you want to chime in on this Green New Deal idea and the work that UNDP is doing, and then to Julie and Carolina on the use of technology and other innovations in your programmatic responses. Thanks.
Yes, great, thank you. And thanks a lot for bringing this up, because I also absolutely agree that a grand sort of thinking now is needed, and we do have an enormous opportunity to really start building what the UN calls building back better. And you've mentioned that multilaterals also have a role to play, and in UNDP we actually are seeing a lot of push and support to the programming that on one hand supports social protection objectives and then green jobs or green recovery objectives. We have now a window of financing that really focuses on how to use the two in tandem. And we've seen different, these are not massive programs, but I think it's a step in the right direction. So we see green youth corps, we see different green public works. We see a lot of community rehabilitation and infrastructure where community also participates and so on. So I think these are very positive steps. But in terms of other intervention that could be of interest to this clinic, and I have not seen much of them, and also sort of social protection is about new skills that will be needed for the green economy and for the transition to the green economy once we go back to the business as usual might be too late. And why not use the massive stimulus to re-educate or provide training so that that people can participate in the green economy. And finally, on this point, in terms of social protection, there is also need to provide disincentives to communities that are harming the environment because they do not have any other sources of livelihoods, including illegal logging or wildlife trafficking and things like that. So I thanks for bringing this up, because there is a lot of attention to this, at least in UNDP, and there is a huge opportunity moving forward. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Last two comments from Julie, Carolina on use of technology, and others if you want to come in on this.
Go ahead, Carolina.
Okay, so yeah, I think this crisis has pushed for digital inclusion, and governments, at least here in Latin America, we see they're giving more importance to this topic. We see the government in Peru, for example, buying 1 million tablets to facilitate e-learning for primary and secondary students, for example. So there is a moment for digital inclusion, and in this sense, Fundación Capital has been investing in integrating technologies into its programming implementation for quite a long time now, and this crisis has pushed us to go further. So for example, in our operations here in Latin America, all the coaching activities had to be suspended, face-to-face interactions, because of the pandemic. So we could leverage some of the digital tools that we already had. For example, apps for coaching and training of participant families, as well as e-learning tools for trainers. And recently we have designed a strategy with the government of Paraguay through our virtual assistant that works in WhatsApp. WhatsApp is really used here in Latin America to send messages to all participants from the National Cash Transfer, which is Tecoporá. So the coaching and training process was not suspended entirely. So while coaches could not visit the families, at least families were receiving communications about prevention, about how to manage household stress, to prevent gender-based violence. And now that we are being able to resume interactions, face-to-face interactions, we see that the response for this strategy, this WhatsApp strategy, was really good, actually. We see that families, more and more, they have smartphones, they have access to internet. So this strategy that came up as solution for this crisis probably is going to remain inside our programming because of the successful results that we achieved.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah.
I would just echo what Carolina had mentioned. I think we're also shifting, for BRAC, doing more with SMS and mobile phones in terms of coaching and health messaging, and have seen some really positive results, but also instituting more rapid diagnostic surveys to understand sort of more in real time what's happening with communities and with participants in the household, and then, helping our coaches and frontline staff respond more quickly to their unique challenges. We've seen this be really successful in the Philippines as well as in Bangladesh, increases in knowledge of hygiene awareness, as well as access to additional top-ups from national cash transfers, and then thankfully having roughly 2/3 of the participants in the Philippines at least continue to maintain or increase their income generating activities. So more consistent touch points and access to information has been really successful for our programs as well.
Great. Given we still have a few minutes, I wanted to ask other speakers on the panel, do you want to comment about the potential for the use of technology in these times? And I liked what you said, Carolina, that a lot of the technology you've adopted in times of crisis is here to stay and is actually an opportunity. I think this has their insights from this into the questions of targeting we talked about before, shock preparedness, etc. So, Samir, Rodolfo, Miguel, if you want to chime in, this is probably your last opportunity to do so.
Just very briefly, I think also beyond this crisis, the opportunity to work more digitally for employment inclusion opens a lot of doors. It starts already with recruitment of people. There is a more bias-free opportunity to recruit because let's say that classical human resources are often biased and often in vulnerable cohorts or in, let's say, areas where there's social hardship, will be probably more difficult to find a job. Some employers would not even reach out to those groups. Through digital recruitment, artificial intelligence, I think it opens more doors to be bias-free and to focus on the skills, not the social environment. Then access to work is through digital channels easier. Not if there is no digital infrastructure, of course, but that's something to invest into. Finally, I think specific vulnerable groups like persons with disability would have more chances to work in a digital environment from people that cannot access barrier-free offices but can work from home to people, let's say, on the, I don't know, autism spectrum that would feel more comfortable in working in a digital environment than in an office with a team. So yes, I think in general, worldwide, it opens more possibilities, and especially also in vulnerable environments. Technology is a great asset for improving jobs.
Samir, I know that you wanted to chime in also on this question of technology. Please do so.
Thank you, Aude. The use of technology, of course, now I think because in the wake of COVID, one example is from the Ponto Weed program in the Philippines. The ADB is supporting that effort, and that targeting is better. There's less leakage. We're doing and grievance mechanism is better as well in the new system. So we're doing that. The other one is on JobStart. It's a program in the Philippines that we have done. We're doing it also in Indonesia, but part of JobStart is also counseling for young people before they enter the labor market. This is to support the pre-employment card in Indonesia that the government has introduced. But what we are faced with now is that how do you provide counseling now that we can't travel because of COVID? So this is something that we're dealing with and trying to design online virtual ways of doing this. It's an ongoing challenge. Hopefully we can find a good solution in Indonesia. So over to you, Aude. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and we only have 4 minutes left, so I'm going to thank you all for your contributions right now. Just to kind of wrap up this really productive session, I think that we got really inspiring start and from Anna on just reminding us about the scale of the challenge that we're faced with. The unprecedented contraction of GDP that is likely to come upon us soon, the contraction of employment opportunities, both in the formal and in the informal sector, and this term of slow onset emergency that was used, I think, by Anna, and the comparison to the 1930s depression. I think that the reminder we had about the need for a strong recognition of the need to support workers, especially informal workers, was critical for the stability of the world. At the same time, with pragmatism, there were some really interesting reflections on the need not to overload existing social protection programs while really rolling out programming at scale. So I think there was a call for new thinking about how do you get ministries of employment, social protection, agriculture, gender, and all the others to coordinate and rise to the challenge and provide an ambitious, coordinated response to this unprecedented level of crisis, with a call for blue sky thinking, and I think also a lot of pragmatism. I think a few takeaways I take from all of your interventions are that, you know, as we, this is a daunting challenge, but there are a few things that we can do right now. The first is there was a call from BRAC and others, Rodolfo, I think you also mentioned this, Miguel, for more and better collection of data, saying, you know, we need to have a better picture of what's happening out there, especially in the informal economy, to make sure that we are providing informed responses. The second is be prepared. You know, I think Rodolfo in particular, you reminded us that collection of data is a key element of preparedness, but also having strong systems in place and, you know, strong political will. And when you talk about strong systems, I think, you know, there was a lot of mention of the need for a strong digital infrastructure that allows for programs to be rolled out quickly. The third is that I think from Anna and Renata, we heard a lot about the need to kind of not lose sight of the other major crisis that is daunting, you know, and the need to make sure that all these employment and self-employment economic inclusion programs do not lose sight of climate change and the need to have concrete mitigation measures now. So let's keep those goals in mind while we roll out large-scale programs. And finally, the last point that was made is that we can make, this is, you know, in each crisis there's an opportunity, and the one here that I heard a lot about was technology. There's a role for technology in the rapid diagnostic of who needs support where. There's a role for technology in the actual quick real-time identification of people who are falling into poverty, moving above and beyond the poverty lines right now, and for rapid identification of these people. There's a need for, you know, this is also an opportunity for, you know, digital inclusion of people who will have access to coaching, training, etc. through digital tools, just because there's a social distancing need right now, but at the same time, this is an opportunity to get people up to speed. And I liked one of the comments that was made by Miguel saying, you know, this might be an opportunity to be more inclusive rather than less. You know, there are people with disabilities, sometimes women, that might be better included through digital channels than through physical channels if the programs are designed and delivered in the right way. Finally, you know, also the reminder from Latin America, Carolina, that digital tools can also be a really important source of coaching and mental health type of support, and I think it's an important component to keep in mind in this context of pandemic. And just to kind of to wrap up, I think that you know, we were reminded by Samir that linking social protection, employment, and economic inclusion programs was already difficult before COVID, and it's an even bigger challenge right now. But you know, still, I think that there was you know, some inspiration and some you know, visionary thinking that was shared here, saying, you know, at the same time, there's a more appetite for longer term responses, longer term social protection responses. Someone said, you know, social protection and development actors are really starting to talk about long-term employment and economic inclusion measures in a way that they never have before. This was Lisa from DFAT reminding us about this in the previous session. And so there's really an opportunity right now also to really scale up these employment and economic inclusion programs as a medium and longer term response. So with this slightly positive note in a difficult time, I'd like to close this session. Thank you all. Encourage you to continue submitting your questions on the Slido. We're here to try and answer them until October the 8th. Thank you very much. Goodbye.